The life history approach is basically a way to explain why things like impulsivity, mating patterns, social sexuality, and the like tend to, cluster in interesting ways, and why they're functionally interesting. That's that's what makes it, relevant if you're, say, an evolutionary-minded theorist. You want to kind of understand why things are the way they are.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more. Dr. Marco Del Giudice is an associate professor in the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Trieste, Italy. His interdisciplinary research sits at the crossroads of human behavior, evolution, and development, and has led to integrative models such as the Adaptive Calibration Model of stress responsivity, an evolutionary developmental model of sex differences in attachment, and a unifying life history framework for evolutionary psychopathology, which is obviously the area we're most interested in today of your many hats, Marco. His work, yes, spans so much: personality, motivation, attachment styles, developmental plasticity, and more recently, evolutionary immunology. He was awarded the 2016 Early Career Award by the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. Probably not quite so early career anymore, Marco. You're sort of more doing senior and established career. Let's put it that way.
Mid-career. Mid-career.
He's well known for pushing boundaries in understanding how evolution shapes our minds and behaviors, and especially in evolutionary psychiatry. His book, Evolutionary Psychopathology, is actually the book I still recommend to anyone who wants a thorough, book-long review of essentially every hypothesis in evolutionary psychiatry. It's truly a fabulous resource. I turn to it multiple times a year. So I'm really absolutely grateful for Marco to create this honestly wonderful book. And we'll talk a bit more about some of the core theses that he advances in that book, as well as it being a great review of the field. He also has added his own slant on explaining individual differences, which is a lot of my work is also focused on. So, so yes, I'm really looking forward to chatting to you, Marco. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Um, so yeah, I think it would just be fun to kind of talk a little bit about your personal history, why you got into this field, what evolutionary psychopathology and psychiatry, and yeah, this stuff.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me first. Um, I think it was destiny in a sense because I actually started out as a clinical psychology major. Um, so my kind of first love, first interest was in clinical psychology, psychopathology, and then from there I actually started my first actual research was in on attachment um, and emotions. And in both cases, I was kind of lucky to get a an evolutionary introduction to um, right see, attachment theory, which you can do in different ways, right? And I was lucky to get an introduction that really emphasized the evolutionary angle, so kind of drew me a bit closer to the field. And then I went on doing a bunch, research on a bunch of topics. You mentioned some of them, like stress, developmental plasticity, some stuff about the role of hormones in development, sex differences. But all the topics had something relevant to psychopathology. So I didn't deal directly with psychopathology for a while, but kind of every topic I touched was kind of relevant and contained some interesting ideas and some interesting links to clinical psychology and mental disorders. So, and eventually it all kind of came together kind of naturally. Uh, and I got really interested in Bernie Crespi's diametrical model of autism and psychosis, which I think is kind of one of the most brilliant ideas probably in the last 20 years. Um, and from there, so I kind of worked in that perspective a little bit, and I suggested a kind of an extended, slightly, I don't know, updated, reframed uh, diametrical model that brought in mating strategies, kind of mating versus parenting trade offs and the like. So bringing some kind of life history perspective on trade offs. And from there, I realized that that perspective, you could actually broaden it a little bit, and it could serve as a bit of an organized framework to think about the classification of psychopathology and like big clusters, connections with individual differences in personality, and so that's what gave me eventually impulse for the book. So wasn't it you like started out with a clinical interest, did a whole bunch of different things for a while, and then it kind of came to back together again. So yeah,
Cool. Interesting. Yeah, and I know that you, in my conversations with you previously, you've talked about working with clinical psychologists and talking to them,
mm,
and it's cool. And now you're back in Italy, right? And you have connections there, which is gonna be interesting to see what you do with that. So I think actually it would be good just to go over what fast, slow life history strategies are, because I think this is quite a general audience. I don't know if we've had a fast, slow person specifically on. We've had Martin Bruner talking a little bit maybe about personality disorders, but um,
All right.
yeah.
It's going to take.
Well,
You help me keep
give
it
us
short.
the cliff notes. Yeah.
all right. Uh, yeah. Let me think about it. So, okay. So there's really the first step, along the way is this is an approach to individual differences, really, where you extrapolate from some evolutionary, let's say, ideas and theoretical models that we used to describe initially differences between species. And the initial thing is you see species approaching life and reproduction in very different ways. And so in some species, you have very slow development, like usually few offspring, pretty big bodies, large body size, and it's kind of slow reproduction with a lot of investment, like energetic and whatever time investment from parents. So that's one. And these species that do also see longevity. So the species that take it slow.
So
Right.
this is like elephants and whales, right? Elephants and whales are classic as us. Humans, yeah.
And then you see species that do the opposite pretty much. So,
Rabbit.
fast reproduction, early development and maturation. Usually, litter size is larger, mortality is higher. So you have there's a pattern, like a patterning of variation between species, and now that's being approached theoretically from different perspectives. So you can explain, you can try to explain it in different ways, but the pattern is definitely something that you see. And at some point, you know, both in biology and in psychology, there's been this idea of trying to look at individual differences from that same perspective, right? So the idea that these differences in how organisms balance out, right? Things like how early you start to reproduce, how much investment you put into reproduction, whether you're kind of trying to maximize in a sense, but it doesn't have to be deliberate, right? It could be just your behavioral patterns or physiological, let's say, predispositions to invest more in, it's called mating effort, right? One of the trade-offs is mating effort. So trying to find mates, mate with those mates, so have offspring, versus the investment in parenting, where you spend time, energy, and so forth in kind of raising the offspring, providing them with food, shelter, teaching and whatnot. So uh, that's the general idea. So mating versus parenting is one basic kind of trade-off that relates to essentially how you allocate your effort within different components of reproduction.
Right.
Uh, then you can see this from that's different angle in terms of present reproduction. So organisms kind of don't wait to reproduce. As soon as they are able to reproduce, they start to do so, versus accruing maybe resources or better skills or whatever to improve reproduction later. So a trade-off between the present and the future, right? Um, and there are others. So the basic idea is you try to explain this patterning that you see in these life histories, right, of organisms, uh, as different solutions of certain trade-offs between doing things in prioritizing some components of fitness versus other components. And that can happen at level of species, can also happen at level of individuals, because some individuals might be, predisposed for whatever, in whatever way. And we'll talk about mechanisms, I guess, in a second, to maybe invest more in traits that favor, let's say, early reproduction and mating effort versus maybe later reproduction and parent effort. So that's
Right.
that's the basic case. So the idea that you can study individual differences the same way. In biology, this is known as pace of life syndromes. The idea that you can explain behavior. That's the other. Okay, maybe I should have said that. So the first step is to kind of translate or try to translate. There are some difficulties there. This between species pattern into something that had to illuminate individual differences within the same species. Right, that's the first thing. The other kind of step in the chain of reasoning is going from purely, let's say, uh, physiological, metabolic, right, differences to differences in behavior. And here's the idea: is that mating, parenting, reproduction are all things that involve behavior pretty strongly, right? So that, for example, think about animals, right? Differences in things like how exploratory an individual is, or how much an individual invests in, say, aggressive competitive behaviors that may be helping competition for mates and stuff like that. So there are behavioral components that feed into the same trade-offs.
Right.
So behavioral traits that make you more effective, let's say, in beta context versus a parenting context, for example. So that's the idea. You can explain behavior as well. And maybe, if you're lucky, be able to link behavioral differences with, say, metabolic, physiological, uh, reproductive, maturational differences, developmental differences, and the like. So that's the idea. That's kind of the complete idea. In biology, there's no that space of life syndromes when you're linking this kind of behavioral. They call it then syndromes, but really it's kind of whatever personality, behavioral profiles, and try to link it with other traits. In humans, you well usually talk about, say, personality, but of course, personality is also linked to in very many interesting ways to the risk for different types of mental disorders and psychopathology. So really you have something that, the whole spectrum from regular, say, individual differences to uh, pathological differences to some extent. The idea is that if you can identify um, dimensions of behavioral trade-offs that explain some individual differences in a kind of functional way, so not just descriptive. Uh, which is the limitation of standard personality psychology is that you're basically describing patterns. You're measuring, whether behaviors or descriptions, right? And the analyze them in different ways. You're trying to summarize what you see. How many dimensions of variations are there? What's the best way to describe them or label them? But you're not really explaining why they're there in the first, right? The first place. And you're not talking about the function of those differences. Although maybe you have some ideas about that. So something like a life history approach, if it works, helps you ground individual differences in some functional, right? Uh, Functional mechanisms such as, for example, trade-offs and allocation of, say, the individual's priorities between whatever mating and parenting or what you have. So uh, it must be said. I mean, you're probably going to say next, but I'll let you comment on that. So this idea of using in humans, especially using these life history strategies, and again, one way of summarizing these is this kind of fast versus slow dimension, which is not the only way to look at it, but it's become kind of popular even to use this label. Applying that to human, say, personality, individual differences has first has gotten a lot of people excited starting from the 90s. So it's become a very popular approach in evolutionary, say, developmental psychology, things related to attachment theory and attachment styles, but also in personality theory and so forth. And more recently, has come under a lot of scrutiny. So right now there are some really interesting and heated debates about you know uh, both the theoretical foundations for, right, the idea of, say, a fast slow continuum, but also what is the fast law continuum about? If it exists, what are the driving trade-offs? What are the traits that kind of legitimately are part of this dimension of variation? Is it the best way to describe what's going on? And so there's just a lot of debate going on, and I've played a part in this debate, which is uh, in my intention. I've tried to be a reformer from within, in a sense. So I've Uh, well, so I still think of course, it's a simplified framework, right? It's a very it's one dimensional, not as a, it's not derogatory. It's just what it is, right? You're trying to describe things according to one particular interesting dimension of differences. My proposal is that the essence in humans of this fast versus slow, you know, dimension of say organization of behavior, uh, has to do mainly with the trade-off between mating and parenting, which might not be the case in other species. Because it again, one of the things you can say about this fast versus low continuum is that it doesn't have to be identical in every species. So it's a bit of a catch-all term for slightly different things that might go into that. Which is, again, you can criticize it or think it's kind of a reasonable heuristic once you accept that you're maybe describing slightly different things depending on context.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm quite diplomatic, and I think that there's something there. Okay, right. So just to kind of put it very concretely, I mean, talking about this live fast, die young, like personality types and people who go, have crazy youths and have babies really early and maybe put themselves in danger. This is kind of a classic observation, and
Right.
whether or not people fall into either doing that or living really slow and careful lives is the question, right? Can you just put everyone on this continuum? But there's something there, especially in relation to the relationship to stress, which was where a lot of your work, your early work with
Mm.
around Jay Belsky's stuff, sort of makes sense. I can see that there's going to be really, it's a useful framework for understanding why if you have a really stressed upbringing, you might just have a different strategy to life because you're not going to live the next 80 years. You don't know if you're going to be able to have kids and raise them and have two kids and put a lot of effort into them because you've had this really you know, terrible upbringing. And you can see how, our hunter-gatherer ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years might have ended up having to face these trade-offs and being in more secure or less secure positions. Therefore, adopting different strategies makes a lot of sense. Um, the so I think it's a useful framework in that respect. Whether or not, and this is what you sort of try to do in your book, which is a fun uh, attempt at kind of putting most psychological disorders into the fast slow continuum, right? And the I think the only I'm sort of I guess I accept more of them than others. Some of them I'm like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, like psychopathy or reaction study. But when it's like, well, how do you explain hallucinations and schizophrenia as like a result of fast life?
No, this, yeah, that's
You know,
right.
that-
Okay. There's maybe a couple of things to say as a premise to this. So before we get to this, um, yeah, you mentioned stress. So initial ideas work from by Jabelsky and others, right? Bruce Ellis has done some of that too. Uh, Now the one of the possibilities is that individual differences are kind of calibrated to early conditions, early life conditions, including stress, including adversity. So things that inform you in some ways about parameters such as mortality or your expected lifespan. How volatile your environment is, which matters because, for example, if you're going to make a consciously or unconsciously, right, long-term investments on things like, again, offspring, parenting, long-term cooperation, whatever, the environment has to have a certain stability. If everything changes, unpredictably, and so people have kind of highlighted adversity, stress, and also unpredictability as possible dimensions of the environment that can calibrate individual differences along this kind of fast and slow. Now you know, that is also debated, also debated, uh, for a few reasons, but let me put it as simply as possible. So uh, in generally speaking, the environmental explanations are a bit in a crisis right now of say personality, individual differences because of the data coming in from behavior genetics. So that there was an assumption at some point, kind of default assumptions that individuals would be uh, made a lot of sense to think that would be very plastic and kind of receptive and open to early conditions and kind of develop along alternative pathways based on things like, again, family, relations, early stress, adversity, and unpredictability, and what we talk about. Uh, then you look at the behavior genetics data, and as you know, they seem to downplay quite a bit the role of what's called the shared environment. So factors that affect basically all kids in the same family. And unless there's something a bit more complicated going on, these kind of effects of, say, adversity, stress, and so forth should have that kind of effect on development. So, uh, but what I want to say is that the existence of a dimension of, say, fast, slow, whatever, however you want to call that, is a separate question from what drives it. If it's a mostly, say, genetic, um, heritable individual differences, or calibrated to the environment, or some combination of both, maybe through gene environment interactions or more copulated patterns. But so there's been a bit of a conflation because a lot of the early work from this, I call it the fast slow paradigm, right? Uh, Also kind of made the assumption that the environment is responsible for individual differences mostly, and that's been changing. In my perspective, we would be changing quite a bit, and I think I have more to say about that later. The first thing. The second thing is what you put in the what if you think about. So okay, there's an approach to this fast and slow dimension of individual differences that tries to squeeze essentially as many traits and behavioral differences as you can within the same big broad dimension. And this will be worked by AJ Figueredo, I think, is the main representative, where they've been trying to work to develop really broad, and also using questionnaires, right? A very broadband conception of what life history strategy, related traits are, and they put in a lot of different things. Uh, I think it works up to a point, but then you start kind of um, essentially lose focus. I mean, you're trying to squeeze everything in, and it becomes a bit unclear. You end up with some kind of general factors of personality, which are also not always the most interpretable. So what are you're putting in stuff that's uh, say behavioral differences, but also stuff that has to do with developmental experiences, all in the same place. Um, okay, so that's an approach that I don't like particularly, and my approach has been to try to isolate specific traits that uh, have a better fit with the concept. So things that actually have implications for trade-offs like mating and parentings, and that do cohere a bit more. So you find phenotypic correlations, genetic correlations, but they also make kind of sense. So I my view of this, when is this fast and slow thinking useful is especially when you try to be very specific about the traits and have a slightly narrower conception of what goes into that. And so my proposal is that if you want to go to the essence of what kind of traits are we talking about, is things like impulsivity and risk taking. That's maybe the most fundamental thing, because it has to do with really how you trade off between the present and the future in a whole range of domains potentially. So impulsivity, risk taking, um, if I have to pick one trait, that would be it. And then you find impulsivity and risk taking also correlate with different types of mating styles and sexual styles. So, more unrestricted versus more restricted social sexuality, the stability of romantic, attachments, pair bonding, couple relationships, which in humans are one of the key kind of conduits that lead you to actually invest then effort in your offspring. So, stable relationship with a partner or potentially more than one. Um, and uh and then slightly more peripheral things like you know patterns of affiliation, cooperative versus more maybe exploitative attitudes. And so that's if you think about it from personality, and with the language of personality models, uh most of the traits that I think are the core of this dimension of variation have to do with agreeableness, conscientiousness, and from a different kind of model, the honesty, humility kind of traits. So that's what I think is kind of the core of um, the behavioral traits that in humans helps define investment into mating versus parenting, which I also think is kind of the defining trade-off for this kind of variation, which is something some people disagree about this. What is the essential thing, and also um, s- they have to do with mating versus parenting, but also a bit more generally with how people manage risks and rewards in the future versus the present. So that would be my kind of narrow conception. So the way I go about this issue is not to try to explain everything with life history, facets or strategies, but to be a bit more specific about what kind of traits we're talking about, and then. Uh, at that point, so the idea of the psychopathology framework then is really not to explain disorders as manifestations of fast or slow life history strategies. And that's a very common misconception. I guess it's also kind of a natural misconception. So I need to I need to address it. But
If you read your book, it does seem like that's exactly what you're trying to do. No effect. That's it. Yeah, cross.
I hard it out. If you, if you this chapter 5, chapter 6 of the book, but I really got to be very explicit at some several points in the book that so here's my short version of what I was trying to do with the book, and the framework more generally. So okay, we have these you know let's say it's not one specific dimension of behavior, right? It's a cluster of things about behavior that's to do with impulsivity versus long-term orientation, your mating, sexual kind of attitudes, and so on. All right. This cluster of behavioral traits is not the whole of personality. So there's more stuff to personality. For example, it leans out uh, everything, the whole, say, neuroticism, um, negative emotionality spectrum, extroversion is not really part of it, although maybe some components. So it doesn't cut. Okay, it doesn't slice up thing in this exact same way as, let's say, the big five model of personality is a bit different. So you're isolating one set of things about behavior. And what's interesting about those things about behavior is not that they are, say, more important or broader or more explanatory than others, but you have some functional understanding of what's going on in terms of, say, favoring mating effort versus parenting effort, or so managing trade-offs between components of fitness. So that's why it's interesting and important. And now you can look at this fast low continuum as a broad dimension of individual differences. There's going to have a bunch of effects on things like, from again, couple relationships, sexual relationships, um, again, risk taking of various sorts, and so on and so forth. And now the idea is that's one possible way to start parsing individual differences, not just in these particular behaviors, but in the risk for different kinds of psychopathology that connect to these dimensions of personality and behavior. So the idea is to let's say uh, create a very simple, actually it's this kind of simple possible coordinate system, right, for individual differences. And now you can start looking at different types of syndromes, disorders, psychopathologies, and you know you can see that there are some disorders that are kind of obviously and pretty robustly connected to more, say, impulsive, risky, antagonistic personality styles. And then you can look at, say, conduct disorder, psychopathy, borderline personality disorder, as this kind of mix of impulsivity, um, in a way hypersexuality, or at least unrestricted sexuality, and so forth. So you're not explaining those things necessarily as life history strategies, but they're kind of connected to some of the traits that define this continuum. And then you going to see on the other end of the spectrum, you see other things that actually correlate. So the idea is not to explain disorders in this way, although in certain specific cases maybe that works out. but it's to have a coordinate system to place disorders and explain, for example, why certain disorders tend to go together, have genetic and environmental correlations. So why, for example, the borderline, antisocial kind of spectrum tend to they're not just independent disorders, tend to kind of cluster together. There's also some interesting genetic correlation with things like, psychosis risk, bipolar disorders. So the idea is that you're looking at something that helps explain why disorders are kind of organized in terms of, say, comorbidity, genetic risk, environmental risk, in the way they are. If you then, to the extent that these dimensions of behavior are influenced by things like, stress, adversity, and so on, then you have some leverage to, explain why certain disorders tend to cluster especially strongly in, settings and contexts where there's a lot of adversity, and maybe other disorders not so much. There are actually some, general rule is that the worse you get it, right, in terms of socioeconomic status, adversity, and so forth, the higher the risk for many different disorders. But there's also an uptick for some disorders at the other side, in kind of safe, protected, higher SES. So the idea is that you have an organizing framework to start to parse comorbidity patterns, correlations with, say, environmental risk variables or protective variables, depending on how you look at it. And then the other thing you might be able to do, again, to the extent that this dimension is relevant, is sometimes you have something that's classified as one diagnosis, right, in one box, something like, I don't know, ADHD, which is one diagnosis in the DSM. Uh, Although it's obvious from all sorts of data that it's actually very heterogeneous. So there's a lot of stuff that, different syndromes, possibly with different explanations and different, pathogenetic mechanisms that get clustered within this big diagnostic category. And the challenge for psychiatry, not just evolutionary psychiatry, but psychiatry in general, is, going beyond recognizing heterogeneity and actually try to, parse things in a way that makes sense. And uh, and in some cases, I think this lens of looking at, say, variants of, let's say, Conan variants, we can, talk about the proper language, but say variants of, say, uh, ADHD or eating disorders. That's a good example. If you look at eating disorders, right, they tend to cross over a lot. So some people get, uh, bulimia, and then it moves into anorexia. There's a lot kind of back and forth between different times. So it's a bit of a cluster, right? Eating disorders. But when you look at the kind of people that get eating disorders with different manifestations, what you see is there's a certain kind of space in eating disorders that has to do with impulsivity, more kind of risky behavioral traits, kind of unstable, uh, okay, let's say it's the correlations with things like, again, borderline traits. So that's one kind of cluster, and you find a bit more bulimic symptoms that say restrictive anorexia, although the distinction is not that clear cut. So if you try to distinguish based on symptoms, you don't go very far. But if you start distinguishing in terms of profiles, like personality profiles of people in disorders, you definitely see there's a cluster that has more to do with, say, impulsivity, poor self control, poor self regulation, and then there's a cluster where what you have is a bit the opposite, so highly restrictive,
High conscientious.
kind of exactly, and 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 that does map onto these fast low dimension that we identified and described. And so that's one way you can parse disorder. And very importantly, so what it does for you, if you to some extent, whether you buy the life history interpretation or not, that's something I maybe should have emphasized the book more. But the life history approach is basically a way to explain why things like impulsivity, mating patterns, social sexuality, and the like tend to cluster in interesting ways, and why they're functionally interesting. That's that's what makes it relevant if you're, say, an evolutionary minded theorist. You want to kind of understand why things are the way they are. But
Right.
it's legitimate to just describe these dimensions as, descriptive. stuff. Some people are more, say, impulsive, risk takers, less, stable couple relationships. They want more sexual partners. And the like. So you can just describe it without linking it, if you want, to this kind of theoretical uh, framework of the history theory. So, and then what I'm saying is, uh, that actually helps you make sense of the structure of mental disorders, because that seems to be a very relevant and interesting dimension for a lot of distinctions that are useful and interesting in psychiatry. So there's precedent. So other people have proposed, like, under controlled versus over controlled, which kind of maps on it too. So that's it. The framework I propose in the book, which is kind of an update of previous work, I added a kind of a second dimension. So there's kind of Fasten's law as one way to parse things, and then I'm suggesting there's another kind of cluster of disorders that have to do with activation of defenses, like protective defenses like, anxiety, sadness, fear, and so forth, which is kind of maps approximately on what's called the internalizing spectrum. So, and that's the first cue that I'm not really trying to explain everything as fast versus low. I mean, there's the defense activation dimension, I think, is largely independent of that. Um, and I don't even think this is the only or even best way to classify disorders. So it gives you can you have options. So from your perspective, you can think of disorders of, say, cooperation, disorders of, so you can use different lenses and different, so psychopathology is very complex. It Each disorder has multiple, many disorders are very heterogeneous, so there's lots of stuff going on. So you know I honestly don't think there will be one evolutionary framework to rule them all. uh I
One
think
point that you one point that you've made to me before is that this mating parenting dimension is very interesting because it's the sort of crux of natural selection and reproduction and evolution. And so because mating, every single ancestor had to be mating and then sort of parenting a bit. So whatever was happening to our schizophrenic and autistic and neurotic and OCD ancestors, there was definitely mating and parenting. And then you get into these complexities, like, was it actually the schizophrenic who was mating, or was it their family members who had some clinical traits? But I can see why there's a justification to think about to think about mating parenting, the different styles you can mate and parent in, and recognizing that you can have variation, quite significant variation, which is actually adaptive in different ways. Because sometimes it is just better to mate more and parent less and care less for your offspring, and then sometimes it's better to just have 3 or 4 kids that you put everything into, have a stable relationship, and those can just be those can be adaptive strategies simultaneously. And that's where the kind of fast, slow continuum, even if it is an analogy or not exactly what the origin of the fast, slow.
first is about organization. You can argue that it's kind of a loose adaptation of some concept that maybe make a certain kind of sense between species, and then with each species you have to, and then some people argue that it's kind of, too much of a stretch. So you're really not talking about the same thing anymore. I think that, there are connections, but you have to, change your thinking. And when you move from between species to within species, there's also, things change in more than one way. So, but I think the broad concept remains useful as long as you understand that you keep it narrow and you're not trying to explain everything with it.
And it is getting to this critical point of explaining individual differences, which is that you require trade-offs. There is no perfect strategy. If there was a perfect strategy, we would all be following that strategy. So, for humans, the perfect strategy is to grow to between a certain, 5 foot and 6'6", and to be hungry and whatever. But then there's no perfect strategy for mating. There could have been alternative strategies. And if there were persistent opportunities for these different alternative strategies to exist, then you would expect traits to sort of evolve into them. which is basically the core principle we need to explain individual differences at all, and which is where, yeah, the life history stuff and maybe the mating dimension that you talk about is useful. So I think actually at this point it would be interesting to go on to your flowchart which I think is also a really nice. I don't know if it was first put forward in your book. Was it first in the book? It's also in the most recent paper.
The version I prefer.
It's been okay.
I think I published it in a couple of papers before, and then I kind of updated a little bit. And the one in the book I think is the
Okay.
what is the final version, but the one I like best.
So basically, so you point out. I'll just kind of quickly explain it because something will be on audio. So basically, you point out that mental disorders are all kind of undesirable conditions. That's just whatever it is. Society has defined these conditions as undesirable for social and psychological reasons, perhaps contingent on current norms about what is appropriate behavior. And then under that category, we can kind of split up those undesirable conditions into different evolutionary defined disorder categories, which I've also done a little bit in my work, but I think yours is actually almost a bit simpler. So on the very clear end of dysfunctional mechanisms where something has just very obviously gone wrong, like there's been take a single mutation which causes very severe intellectual disability. That is, something that we can just kind of clearly say is a harmful dysfunction, as Jerome Wakefield would put it, who's also been on the podcast before, of course. And so that's this whole separate category of conditions, which I think actually we don't really need evolutionary explanations. I mean, you want to explain why mutations happen.
Well, breaks down and why, and you do evolution to tell you what's a dysfunction, right?
Yes, you need evolution to say, okay, right, there was no evolution. The idea is there's no evolutionary history here. There's no interesting question of what were the ancestors doing.
Or breaks down or malfunctions, and it can be genetic, can be environmental. I mean, maybe just high levels of stress or certain particularly disrupting conditions, infections, whatnot. Maybe they interfere with the wiring of your brain, your neurobiological systems, and
toxins.
at some point develop some kind of disorder.
Right. So that's a very clear, okay, these are individual differences which we classify as disorder, which don't really need an evolutionary explanation as traditionally thought by evolutionary psychiatry. And then we have this whole, these other three categories, which are subsumed into two categories, but where evolution is interesting. And so where kind of functional mechanisms are involved. And so if we want to fully explain what's going on here, we need some explanation of evolutionary functions.
No, nothing works. So the first, so how you use evolutionary principles to like parse different kinds of disorders, right? You can do this in different ways. So for example, Randy Nesse, I think has a great kind of taxonomy, and his taxonomy, however, is of reasons, right?
Yeah.
Reasons why people are vulnerable to disease, and there's 4 or 5 kind of big categories, and so that's one way to think about it. And this is kind of complementary to that, and the idea is to make distinction based on two binary distinction. One is, okay, the mechanism that's involved in the disorder, is it actually kind of disrupted? Is it not working as it should? So there's a dysfunction. That's one thing. But sometimes you can argue that the mechanism is working, so there's no dysfunction. The mechanism is working as, let's say, intended, right? Adaptations are not broken. And that becomes kind of interesting because the mechanism is kind of intact, but it's giving you some outcome that's not, it's recognized as undesirable. That can happen for a couple of reasons. So the first thing is you can have something, a mechanism that's functioning properly, but the outcome is maladaptive at the population level, in the sense that there's something going on that really turns some potentially adaptive product of mechanisms into a maladaptive product, and that's an evolutionary issue.
So like fat building is one. I mean, we usually talk about mental disorders, but say, okay, even just maybe anxiety in general. We don't really need anxiety anymore. Like for many, to a pretty decent extent, we've made everything so safe that we don't really need to feel as anxious as we do. So maybe it's just overall slightly maladaptive to have this like neuroticism, certain types of neuroticism.
You could say, right? I mean, that's one class of explanations for mental disorders, where you say you know it's the environment. The environment has changed in such a way that there are kind of sometimes they're kind of cartoon versions of, say, mismatch, which is probably, I think, the single most popular category of evolutionary explanation in clinical psychology. So when psychotherapists kind of adopt some bits and pieces of evolutionary explanation, usually has to do with mismatch and stuff like, social, whatever, speaking anxiety. Think of something like speaking anxiety or social phobia. And it is that, well, it's not you. Uh, is in our evolutionary past, we used to interact with just a small number of people, and we know everybody, and so meeting strangers usually as an element of danger. And now we're like meeting strangers, interacting with strangers all the time, and so of course we get anxious. So that's the kind of evolutionary mismatch thing, which the mechanism is perform, it's not malfunctioning, but the environment is leading it to give you not just undesirable, but evolutionarily maladaptive outcomes. So stuff that impacts your fitness in a negative way. Uh, it gets a kind of more interesting when a mechanism, potentially can be intact, so it's not malfunctioning. There's no evolutionary mismatch in the sense that at the population level, you're still getting adaptive outcome. So it's still improving your fitness on average. It's not like the environment has changed in a way that makes that kind of psychological mechanism damaging or counterproductive. And at that point, you can make another distinction between whether the you know the outcomes are generally adaptive. So if what you're seeing is essentially some kind of adaptive strategy, which could be a defense, like, something like, I don't know, fever, right? If you think about fever, well, fever in itself is not a disease, is not the organism malfunctioning, it's not a mismatch with the current environment. It's just a defense, which helps you, fight off pathogens. And even when it works as it should, it's, makes you feel terrible. So fever is not the fever would be an example of something that is not, it's on the opposite end. It's not, if at one end you have harmful dysfunction where something is clearly not functioning properly, where fever would be at the opposite end. And in psychopathology, there's a case to be made for, say, psychopathy and antisocial disorders, that maybe, what they are. There's not really, a brain dysfunction involved, or some kind of disruption of development. It could be some kind of a alternative, facultative kind of behavioral pattern that actually can be biologically successful, because you might end up having living descendants, so you can actually improve your fitness at the same time making everyone around you miserable and creating all sorts of social problems. But and that's why we call it a pathology, right?
Right.
But it's not maladaptive. It's not broken. It's just something we don't like, and exists because it has certain kinds of biological advantage. So that would be one, the opposite end, right? And then there's probably the most interesting combination of things where the mechanism is functional. Uh, on average, the outcomes of the mechanism are adaptive. So at the level of the population, there's no mismatch. But for various reasons, a mechanism that on average gives you adaptive outcomes can have maladaptive outcomes for some individuals. And that's the I think so. Even within evolutionary psychiatry, there's been relatively little work on that region, say, of the space of possibilities. And I think it's a very interesting reason. Is a very interesting region because uh, there's lots of things, even in a well-designed organism, right? That's facing kind of challenges in an environment that's kind of matches its adaptations. There's so many ways for things to go wrong occasionally. So learning, just give you a few examples, right? Um, if you have developmental plasticity, so your developmental mechanisms are kind of matching you to the environment, there could be a mismatch between the environment you grow up in and what happens later. So the environment changes and you end up, being mismatched. So that's a mechanism that maybe it works, more often than not, but in some cases leaves you with the kind of wrong phenotype for your environment. Um, Maladaptive learning. It's impossible to design a perfect learning system. So if you whatever you're using to learn about the environment can sometimes give you, get you to the place where you're learning the wrong things or counterproductive or maladaptive patterns. So you could just one example would be, let's say you at some point for whatever reason you get the information that the environment is extremely dangerous, and you stop exploring the environment and you become very wary, and that's, you can end up in a loop where you're basically reinforcing your assumption, and there's no way for you to disconfirm that the environment is not dangerous because you're never exploring and testing the boundaries of what you know. Or, theory of mind. We have, humans have, we don't just have, say, reinforcement learning and like associative learning. We have very powerful ways to create mental models of the world, mental models of other people, of ourselves. And that's a very, that's incredibly powerful. And at the same time, it can go wrong spectacularly in all sorts of ways. So you could start, for example, getting, paranoia. You could see that as kind of a, it's not, having a theory of mind and even being suspicious about other people's motivations is not necessarily bad for you. It's probably part of the, how the game is played. But occasionally you can have in some people that leads you to a place where your express is kind of maladaptive, and so on and so forth. Risky. No, if you think of, and that's relevant to the fast slow, idea, because you can think of some behavioral strategies as involving some amount of risk taking. Now, there's the literal version where you're actually taking risks in the sense that you like the thrill of risk, or insensitive to danger, or whatever. So it's kind of literal version. But you can think of some strategies as risky in the sense that the outcomes are more variable. So, for example, people who are, children who are very, say, aggressive and confrontational, disruptive, aggressive. Now, what is that, right? And people have thought about, say, aggression and disruptive behavior in kids in different ways. You can think one option is maybe that's a mode of dysfunction. That's the standard way of thinking in psychopathology. Is like, okay, there's something wrong with the kid in the sense that he does, maybe, there's something wrong about the environment. The kid didn't learn the proper self-regulation strategies, or there's some kind of, whatever, some dysregulation of the stress system, or what you have. So one option is that it's actually some kind of dysfunction, or it could be uh, maybe an adaptive thing, right? It could be, some people have made the case for, say, antisocial, at least certain subgroups of antisocial psychopathic kind of disorders. And one option is, however, that this kind of aggressive social competition is, you can think about it as a kind of a high risk strategy. So you might succeed, but you might also fail spectacularly. And so, in fact, if you look at the developmental literature, I think there's, many indications that children who are, say, aggressive and confrontational and so on, sometimes they end up being rejected by peers and kind of marginalized from the group, and they get all sorts of bad outcomes. But in other cases, they may actually that can work, and they become, let's say, successful bullies, right?
Yeah, the dream of being a successful bully, really ruling the playground. Yeah.
That and so, uh, the point being that if you just look at the average outcome, right, you correlate it with all sorts of social outcomes, whatever, self-esteem, what you have, and maybe you'll find that on average, uh, aggressive kids have worse outcomes than others. But that's, maybe that doesn't tell you the whole story. It's possible that if in a subset of cases you actually have, you know, really good social success, that can actually compensate fitness wise. So, and so, or schizotypy, right? The predisposition to psychotic experiences, which a lot of people have, and they never develop any psychotic disorder. So things like, some people are just predisposed to things like, magical thinking, kind of paranoid ideation, and then thinking
Conspiracy
that
theories, yeah.
that kind of, paranoid. Um, Weird, maybe perceptual experiences, maybe bordering on hallucinatory at certain times. But overall, most people who are high on this kind of schizotypy, like continuum, they never develop any disorder. Uh, and but they are at increased risk for developing things, the even serious disorders like schizophrenia, which is by almost all accounts a dysfunctional pattern. So uh, one way of thinking about it that I think buys you some leverage is thinking of schizotypy as uh, sort of a high risk strategy in the sense that uh, it can give you some benefits potentially, and those benefits, what Jeffrey Miller, others, I think they're mostly right. They argue have to do with mating. In terms of becoming on kind of fascinating, interesting, seductive, potential partner with, because these traits also increase your creativity, or, verbal creativity, and your social, interest, and so on. And in humans, we have courtship. It is not just courtship by, it's not like we bang our heads, and then the frog is like, you see what I'm saying? So there's a lot of, social thoughts, well, seduction is an interesting thing that involves a lot of, language, creativity, and all sorts of cognitive skills as well. So the idea has been proposed, not by me originally. I've kind of worked it into this framework, is that these kind of traits maybe potentially give you, when it works well, and maybe when your let's say your overall, say, cognitive quality, so you're actually, not just schizotypal but also smart, you don't have a lot of, say, bad mutations or neural kind of dysfunction and so forth, that can make you very successful, especially in, say, the mating arena. At the same time, it exposes you to failure, which means that if you have the if you get unlucky, and maybe because you have the traits plus maybe some cognitive vulnerability or lots of bad mutations and lots of stress in your growing up, and so on and so forth, maybe the wrong kind of infection at the wrong time where you are in the uterus, or things like that, then it also exposes you to kind of catastrophic dysfunction. And that, I think it helps to think about it in terms of risk, right? A kind of pattern that, in opens up your potential outcomes from really good to really bad, because that helps you, well, for evolutionary, for the evolutionary study of satellite schizophrenia, it really directs your thinking about what you should measure and who you should compare with whom.
Right.
For example, if you're looking at people, so by this account, which again, IT is one possible account of schizophrenia, but the idea that, at least in some people, it's kind of, you have a predisposition to psychosis that is kind of a risky predisposition to have, but with some potential benefits. Okay. uh, if you look at people with schizophrenia, patients with schizophrenia, those are more likely to have not just the predisposition, but also some other negative contributions, right? They contribute to make them ill instead of successful. And so, what's the right comparison? So, from this perspective, you don't just want to compare, say, patients with schizophrenia or the close relatives of patients with schizophrenia with people without schizophrenia. You should also try to find people who have the same amount of, schizotypal predisposition but don't develop disorder, and see how they're doing. So,
Right.
uh, we need to, in the same way that is in developmental psychology, if you're just comparing the aggressive kids, right, um, with the non-aggressive kids, you're probably mixing things up. And so one thing that illuminates thing a little bit is to separate aggressive kids into the successful aggressive kids and the unsuccessful aggressive kids, and then you see there's something a bit more complex going on. So I hope I clarified.
Yes. So I just want to reiterate that I think this is probably the most important and least talked about question in evolutionary psychiatry, and it's something that I've only, slowly realized over the last 4 or 5 years. I think that the instinct as soon as you get into the field is to think, okay, schizophrenia, autism, how do we explain them? And you completely forget about this idea of kind of spectrums and there being a kind of a risk and a possible cost, and this concept of inclusive fitness, which is that basically if there's a tendency that to whatever autistic thinking, and in 1% of people it kind of goes a little bit too far or it interacts with the environment in some weird way and it's actually bad for them, but if 5 to 10% of people it's actually quite good, then it can easily balance out and we can see these problems could persist through generations. And you would see, as you kind of do see in autistics and also schizophrenics, you do see the sort of extreme out of the trait there, that does to have some of the strengths, um, but then might not actually be beneficial for the individual depending on their context. And yeah, so this is one thing that I think is super important for explaining individual differences in general, but also psychopathology.
Eh, there's two versions of this argument. So one, and again, uh, for different disorders, the different stories might be about it, right? So it could be that the trait is kind of good for you in small amounts, and then if you get to an extreme of the trait, then it gets bad for you. That's one possibility. Uh, the the mechanism I was mentioning before is slightly different. So it's not, depend if you separate the disorder from a certain maybe behavioral trait that contributes to disorder, say schizotypy. So it's possible that it's not the level of schizotypy by itself that becomes too extreme, but schizotypy by certain other things that essentially drag you toward a maladaptive end. So it might not be the same thing. So for example, let's say, a hypersimplified version of this. Let's say, which is not what I believe, but to give you an idea. Let's say there's schizotypy, right, making you more prone to this kind of again magical thinking, slightly paranoid ideation, and so on and so forth. Uh, and then that interacts with say IQ,
Yeah.
how smart you are. That's not it's too simple. But let's say uh, if your IQ kind of falls below a certain level and you also have high schizotypal traits, then you have a very high risk of, say, a psychotic breakdown. Uh, Now, so that's not just that a lot of schizotypy is bad for you. So a lot of schizotypy might actually take you into a region where the risk is more extreme. So you could do again, maybe it's possible you become a whatever wonderful shaman in a say in a traditional kind of environment, or a famous artist, like a playwright or something like that.
Right.
This is one thing. But it's not just the level of the schizotypal trait. It's the schizotypal trait in interaction with something else about you, which could be, stress, other diseases, and so on and so forth. And that's, again, I think the advantage of thinking in these slightly more detailed terms about disorders, that you allows you to separate, different things to measure and to compare. So, for example, if you, yeah, let's say if you assume some kind of model like this, for example, when you're looking at the genetic correlates of schizophrenia, right? Let's say let's say we hypothesize that maybe schizophrenia is a maladaptive outcome resulting from high levels of this schizotypal kind of predisposition plus other stuff, bad stuff, including bad mutations, low IQ, whatever. Okay. Now, if you just take, say, a big genetic association study and look at the genetic variants that predict the risk of schizophrenia, that you're actually mixing up different things, because you're going to, it's a wide net that is going to get some of the alleles that predispose you to being like a schizotype, right? But also some alleles that maybe have to do with uh, you know let's call it brain dysfunction in a very broad way, like maybe the lower IQ, or make you less kind of less able to stabilize your brain functioning, or whatever level you want to describe it. And so but these different sources of genetic risk might have very different meanings in the context of the hypothesis, and in different individuals you might see one and not the other, or both, or neither. But and that's, for example, this way of thinking alerts you that if you're only looking at patients, you're likely to see people in which there's not just high levels of a certain trait, but a combination of things conspiring to make them at high risk for that kind of thing. So I hope so that's the I think the power of this way of thinking, because it helps approach things like, say, the neurobiology of disorders or the genetics of disorders, of the mechanistic correlates of disorders, uh, you know giving you some tools to make distinctions that are potentially important.
And I
Maybe
think
they're not. Sometimes it's just the level of a trait, but you have different scenarios you want to think about.
and it very nicely, can incorporate a lot of the evidence we have on, stress and mutations are obviously bad, having a role, but also this paradox of why do these individual differences persist? That we can't just ignore that and say, and maybe we should spend a little moment criticizing our critics who believe that all of the individual differences are simply mutations, which is so. I mean, I don't want to get too deeply into it because I will feel like it will just be us sort of slamming on people who aren't here to defend themselves. But there is a
And I think it's a very legitimate debate. It's been going on for about 30 years now,
yeah,
probably long.
right. Yeah. So the basic idea for those who aren't aware is that to explain all of these individual differences in both personality and also psychopathology, or at least the heritable component of personality and psychopathology, is that it's all kind of random mutations that evolution hasn't been able to select out. There's nothing to see here in terms of adaptive strategies, and this is all kind of fabrication of our minds, and none of personality doesn't matter, no matter how much you think you select your partners on personality and you choose your job based on personality. And
But not in the way you think, right? Well, so the idea, for example, the idea that okay, so what's let's call it the null model, though I have issues with that. What you think?
I'm too.
Right. So the thing is, okay, the revolution in genetics and genomics, right, has been to show that traits like not just personality, but also cognitive traits, height, any risks for disorders, they tend to be very highly polygenic, which means that it's not based on one or a handful of genes, but it's actually thousands of genes, and potentially many variants at different parts in places in the genome, each with a if often very often with a small effect, right, especially the common variants. And so when you're looking at a trait like, say, whatever, neuroticism, right, or schizotypy, or autistic traits, you're not going to find just a handful of genes that determine those traits, but there are many genes, and potentially many more than the ones we see. So potentially thousands or tens of thousands of genetic, right, locations where you can have variations. So okay, why is that important? Well, one way it's important is that if your trait is so highly polygenic, uh, just because there's going to be mutations, right? There's a big target for mutations. So you have potentially thousands of genes. Say that even if, right, for that trait, there's actually only one, let's say, extreme stabilizing selection, that's called. So there's one trait level that's good for you. That the
Extra for that or whatever.
any deviation is bad. Now, that could be the two basic patterns. One is directional selection, which basically more is better or less is better. It could be that just extroverted people have just better, higher fitness, no matter what, on average, and so it's better to be more extroverted. Period. But because extroversion depends on so many different genes in the genome, each with a small contribution, thing is, there's constantly going to be an influx of mutations. And those mutations, especially if they just make you deviate just a tiny little bit from the maximum level, so it's not just a huge effect, a tiny effect, right? So that mutation that makes you a tiny bit less extroverted than you could be, right? So that mutation is under negative selection, so the tendency is for it to be driven out of the population, right? But it can just take a very long time. So a mutation that has slightly damaging effects can stay in the gene pool for a very long time. And so you expect to see, even for traits where there's no advantage to variation. So it's not like, because one of the many explanations for, say, differences in, again, personality traits, life history, strategies, again, risk for disorders to the extent that you link them to these other things. Uh, the idea is that there are many, potentially different ways to be successful. So let's say extroverted people do well in certain environments and introverted people do well in other environments. And so uh, what happens could be, or let's say, highly people who have a lot of anxiety, tend to be very anxious and fearful, and people who are bold and fearless, right? Now the idea is that there's maybe different costs and benefits. And so, for example, when the environment becomes, say, more dangerous, it pays off to be more, a bit more fearful and anxious. And when the environment gets, safer and more explorable, it pays off. So it could be that different traits are maybe more adaptive at certain times. So environment changes, becomes, um, there's many things that can change. It's level of danger, level of resources. There's actually, you can see that in animal studies. There's one study of squirrels that I like very much a few years ago, but they were showing that you have bold and aggressive squirrels and like the shy, um, non-aggressive ones, and they tend to do well in different years. So in years where there's just a lot of food around, the shy squirrels are doing better because they don't spend time fighting. They're not like wasting energy and taking risks needlessly fighting with other squirrels for food. Just eat the food, take the food that are good. In years when there's not a lot of food around, the aggressive ones actually do better. And so you have this kind of up and down, which type or extreme of distribution is doing better. That would be an example of so-called fluctuating selection, right? Anyway, so it could be differences in time, in place, in different niches within a population. But the idea is that different versions of a trait can be adaptive in different, let's say, situations. Um, okay, the point is though that you don't need those kind of mechanisms to have a lot of variation. So just because you see people, being very different from one another, it doesn't require that kind of explanation, because if a trait is highly polygenic, you expect to see a lot of variation even if there is just one optimal level of the trait. So, for example, let's say it's just good to be mildly anxious. So mild anxiety is good, is adaptive. Being too anxious is maladaptive, and being completely fearless is also maladaptive. What do you expect to see? Do you expect to see the whole population just concentrated around a single trait value? No, because if the trait is highly polygenic, just because of mutations and the time it takes to drive the mutation out the gene pool, and the fact that certain mutations can drift to to become common just because of random chances, multipopulations, and so forth, you expect to see a lot of variation. So uh, this has been a change of perspective, because it's kind of a sapient realization that you don't need any special adaptive explanation to explain why there's a lot of variation between people. So uh, just maladaptive noise could be sufficient in principle.
Right.
And so that and then you can look for patterns. So now what can you do? You can look at, well, maybe different kinds of selective histories leave different traces. So you can look at things. Now we get maybe a bit more technical. Maybe I don't know if this is the right place, but you can look at
Label, whatever. Let's go.
let's say what's relatively simple thing is, you look at the genetic variants that have a stronger impact on the trait. Now, um, if it's just, if it's the whole thing is driven by mutations, you expect to see, you know, variants of large impact to be very rare in the population, because they're quickly driven out of the gene pool. And the only, variants that you expect to see common in the population are variants with a very small effect. And so you can look at that kind of thing. And there's some tests where you can look at genomic data and try to make inferences about the evolutionary history of a trait. Has it been, or trait, sorry, of a genetic variant, or the the variants associated with certain traits, and try to ask questions like, has it been under negative selection? Has it been under some kind of, say, balancing, selection over time? Um, and this is a very hot topic because some of the results seem to indicate that the default explanation is more likely correct. So we don't see special, let's say, signatures or patterns that you would expect if the trait had been under, let's say, kind of variable selection regime. So it's compatible. The evidence is compatible with the idea that for many traits, physical, psychological, risk of certain disorders, the main mechanism is just bad mutations being slowly driven out from gene pool, and that's the inference is that most of the variation you see between people is in fact maladaptive noise. It's not variation that can be adaptive at different points in time or in different places, but it's just the inevitable outcome of traits being determined by so many genes at the same time. That's the And there's been some, paper by, for example, Brandon Zich has written a paper last year making exactly this argument. It's been made by different people, but now there's a bit of a zeitgeist maybe crystallizing around this issue. The idea that no, the genetic data are basically telling us that the fancy explanations where you have different levels, trade-offs and variable selection or balancing selection of different sorts. Yeah, that's not what's happening, and actually it's probably just random mutations and random noise around some kind of optimal level of trait. um what do you think about that? Because I have something more to say, but I want to hear
So, yes, obviously we both know this paper quite well.
if there's sorry.
I so I
I'm still manning the argument because I think it's a very powerful argument.
Yes, no, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in my 2022 paper on specialized minds, I kind of said, hey, definitely we'll need some random mutation variation to explain individual differences. Um, okay, there are some higher level reasons why I really think that throwing out the baby with the bathwater and saying that all adaptive individual differences um, are, or all apparently adaptive individual differences are not actually adaptive. It's all just noise. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that we have some interesting animal data, and also there's some work in Drosophila flies showing that when there is adaptive personality differences between flies, then the genetics of how they are selected looks kind of like these hundreds of genes which are being pushed up and down. So we kind of know we see that can happen, that these small affected common alleles can be the way that adaptive individual differences exist, and that's also quite plausible from another genetic level, because just large mutations generally are more harmful, and it would be harder. It's very hard, unless you have lactose tolerance or something. It's very hard to kind of find a single protein that you can change which creates an adaptive individual difference, especially in something as complex as behavior. So I think that the small affected alleles could absolutely be adaptive. On another sort of theoretical level, I think it's very strange. It would be very strange if you have all of these predictions from the most kind of fundamental game theory, say like cheating and cooperating. Uh, it's almost like such simple mathematics that if you have a cooperating group, there should be a cheating strategy, and the cheating strategy is kind of its benefit is related to the amount of cooperators around it. But once there are all these cheaters, so this is kind of classic game theory. It also happens to be exactly what we seem to be seeing in these what I might say is adaptive individual differences in agreeableness. You have people who are very psychopathic and are kind of more cheating, and then you have people who are very cooperating. It would be very weird if that whole spectrum is just noise, and it just happens to align with exactly the predictions of the game theory of what you would see in a cheating cooperating group. And also, I think that and then okay, so the third point is just that the Zich's argument also applies across all animal personality differences, basically. So it kind of implies that the animal personality research field has also, which actually thinks quite deeply about and can study directly balancing selection, and has found that great tits do end up having this sort of balancing between bold and shy, and that the genetics behind that is complex in the way that we see human genetics. So if that's all noise as well, then okay, maybe. But then my final point is, I just think it's just really implausible that all this personality is just like, there's no perfect personality, and we're clearly, I think that you can kind of argue yourself into this view if you look at the genetics and because it seems so controversial and like, wow. But I mean, yeah, I mean, good luck if you think you can convince everyone that actually personality doesn't matter at all. There is actually one perfect personality. Everything else is mutated. I don't know if that's just a more of an intuition. And obviously, different personalities do actually do better in different situations anyway. So, like, some personalities are just better at different jobs. We can clearly see that people are better at some things than others, and the personality matters. Is it all just noise? If that's all just noise, it's very convenient noise that just means that everyone can somehow fit into a niche. Yeah. So those are my
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's an interesting. That's a very nice point. I think you put it in that way because there's um it's not, I mean, this argument that individual variations by and large is maladaptive noise. It's not based on functional reasoning or theory, or it's really data driven. It's a data driven inference. So the short version of it is, yeah, sure, could be. It's plausible. It's plausible that you could have balancing selection, or different niches, or yeah, sounds reasonable. Um, However, the data just don't support it. So as plausible as it is, but it's just it's a very, as many things coming out from genomics and genetics. Uh, there's kind of a strongly data driven vibe. 'Cause, and
my point with that is, it sounds so scientific, but like we're at this very quick snapshot, right? Like the data's just coming out. We're at this forefront of genetics. But if you were back 5 years, 10 years, every single thing we've thought we knew in genetics, then we're not. Oh, that was actually wrong.
I'm just stuff. Some things are more robust, but even behavior. So that, like, twin studies. So let's not talk about sophisticated, GWAS and genomics. Even twin studies were a bit like that in the sense that, yeah, lots of ideas about parenting and family environment maybe shapes personality and so forth. However, this is the heritability data and the variance components, and the shared environment is negligible. So sorry, right? So that's, which is again, I'm not arguing that it's necessarily a bad thing. It can be very salutary to have this kind of clash of perspectives on some strong data, in a sense that clash with mainstream assumptions or default assumptions. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just clarifying that uh, it's really driven by certain patterns in the data. And so, which means that it's going to be very, how you interpret them is going to be very dependent on the assumptions you make about how the data come, what the data actually implies. So what inference can you legitimately make from those data, and which you can. And so right now I teamed up with some behavior geneticists, the evolutionary geneticists, and we are working on a paper. Basically, you know, uh, there's going to be two main parts of the argument. That one is that, in fact, the kind of architecture that is called genetic architecture that you see for most traits, which is again, highly polygenic, this distribution of effect sizes. So the most impactful genetic variants tend to be rare, and the more common ones tend to have small effects, and other things. Yes, they are compatible with a uh, mutation selection balance model, where essentially the past scenario is one of fixed selection, either around one optimum or just say more is better. It's compatible. But contrary to intuitions, when a trait is highly polygenic, uh, essentially most other selection histories will give you the same end result. So it's possible for a trait to be under very strong, say, fluctuating selection, And what you see at the end of the process is basically the same broad pattern that you see if there's just one optimum that never moves. Or you can have strong frequency selected depend, and you can show this in simulations. Actually, it's quite striking. The results of the simulation that basically show you that if you what you have is a snapshot at the end of the process, um, you have you can make very limited inferences about what came before, because you're basically going to see the same broad genetic architecture regardless of the actual history of the trait. So if the backward inference from, say, okay, we see this kind of architecture, then now we know that the trait has been under, say, some kind of stabilizing selection. That's actually not as warranted as people seem, some people think at the moment, because the idea is that you should see something different if the trait had been under, say, a balanced selection of different kinds, and
Right.
that doesn't need to be true. What actually happens for highly polygenic traits is that you basically end up with more or less the same architecture regardless of the evolutionary history. And to really see those things, um, you see them very clearly when you have the right data, which means short-lived animals like Drosophila or whatnot, where you actually you have multiple generations. You can track the frequencies of different genetic variants up and down and correlate them with changes in the environment, and then you actually see that process. For example, when the environment changes over time, you see certain genetic variants, becoming more common, and then becoming, more rare depending on the moment, the point of the cycle you're in. You see that happening let's say if you have real time genetic data over multiple generations. If all you have is like a snapshot and you have to make inferences about the past history, turns out it's much more difficult than we tend to assume. And the other part of the argument is that some targeted tests, they are designed to look for so-called fingerprints or signatures of certain specific kinds of selection. Again, when you're dealing with the highly polygenic traits, that might become those tests might become nearly useless, uh, because they're essentially the signatures that you're expecting to see actually might take just, let's say, longer than human beings that have been on the planet to develop it. So there's some technicalities about those tests, which we're basically getting some negative results around those tests, which is another argument that people are using to say, hey, if traits had been under, say, variable selection regimes, we should be seeing these signatures at level of specific genes, specific variants, and we don't see that, and we tend to see patterns that are inconsistent with this. Now the problem is, uh, how much confidence can we have in the results of the test? And my argument is actually not a lot of confidence, actually very little confidence. And the problem, I don't know how you go about this problem, because at the moment, for a species like humans, where you have for essentially little more than a snapshot at the present, like the large data sets are all contemporary humans. We don't have genetic data over dozens or hundreds of generations. We just don't have that, right? We're looking at a snapshot of the genome at the present. Um, the one pattern you're going to see consistently is the one predicted by this mutation selection basic model. The problem is you can't go combat to the inference that that's actually the only process that operated in the past, because the broad patterning is going to be more or less the same regardless. And when you look at specific micro patterns at the level of gene frequencies and sorry, allele frequencies and things like that, the tests are just extremely insensitive. Um, and so you're probably not going to see anything even there. So at the moment, maybe we're going to find new ways, and you can think of ways to go around these problems. And so I'm not saying this is dead end, but at the moment, I think the inferences we can make from genomics to the evolutionary history of certain traits are fairly limited. And so I think there's been a bit of an overcorrection. So people, and I understand why, but people have been looking, in, let's say, the evolutionary psychology or psychopathology. People have been, for decades now, proposing interesting models of why, there is individual variation, or why some, disorders maybe, have some potential benefits alongside the costs. And so there's been a lot of theorizing, right? Uh, we don't have the hard fitness data. We have some data about fitness, but they have problems because, especially say modern populations, we have, contraception and other stuff, real mismatches that makes it really hard to interpret the let's say the direct kind of indicators of fitness. So it's always been necessarily speculative, right? And now you look at the genome, and the hope was to, well, now we can use these new, very interesting and powerful data to test these models. We're not, say, measuring fitness. We can't look into the past directly, but now we can look at the genomes and see what we see. What were the trace? If the traces we see in the genome, the the way evolution has shaped the genetics of these traits is going to tell us something interesting about the past evolutionary history. And turns out doing that is much more complicated than we expected. And so there's been, I think, it's a bit of a back and forth. So we're kind of, and the current idea that essentially it's, all mutations and individual different heritable differences are mostly maladaptive noise. I think it's a bit of an overcorrection. And as people realize the uncertainties and the kind of fundamental uncertainties associated with some of the, the genetic data we have, uh, there's going to be another kind of course correction. And then maybe we figure out, maybe for certain traits we can use more sophisticated data, or maybe compare with whatever ancient DNA, or probe things in a way, so that we get additional insight. But it's not as simple as, let's look at the architecture of the traits. They're going to tell us something clear and unambiguous about the evolutionary history. It doesn't seem to work that way.
The Yeah, it's such a hard problem because, as you say, we have this snapshot. The real truth that we want to know, we want to be able to observe the human genomes for hundreds of thousands of years and see like the micro changes that happened between populations, like 100 years ago to now, and so you'd have to genotype, whole populations and see like the traits going up and down or changing because suddenly there's no food and suddenly the psychopaths are doing better. Um, and we'll just never. I mean, it's beyond a miracle, but we don't even have that many specimens, right? Even if you go to Neanderthal genomes or human ancient DNA, you can't genotype the whole population at one time and then look 2 generations later on and then genotype the whole population then and see whether there's balancing going on. So it is a really hard problem. I don't know if that will ever be solved, but one thing that could be solved is just observing personality traits and seeing that they are sort of better or worse in different situations, which is not the prediction of the noise, right? Like, there's so many predictions of it just being mutations that should account for like all of human personality and animal personality. And actually, you should be able to look around the world and see that there is an optimum personality and everything else is doing like ever more worse. It's an interesting debate, and I'm glad that you're getting into it. I'm wary of time, but I think this is this is maybe a good time to talk about like the future of the field. What are you doing now? What do you think we should do now? How do we go from here, Marco? Guide me.
Yes. So if I'm glad we got to talk about a whole bunch of issues. Um, and I think, even slightly technical at times, but I think gave a good overview of, the some big problems and big debates in the field right now. One of which is about the, life history approach more generally, and this idea of fast versus slow. Does it work? Is it theoretically justified? Is it empirical justified, and so on. So maybe I want to say just one thing about that. One more thing about that, or two, if you let me. Why don't we
Sure.
just a bit, because I'm really, uh, because the debate really is ongoing, and um, so it's probably useful to be slightly more accurate at some point. So one is, I hope I tried to give a sense when we're talking about specific disorders, right, and that kind of, uh, classification of disorder depending on function and adaptiveness. Um, So there's many different pathways to disorders, right? From dysfunctions to maladaptive, locally maladaptive outcomes to maybe adaptive strategies and so on. Um, and for certain disorders, but I'm very convinced that some diagnostic, categories we have actually include a mixture of different things. So some of what goes into, say, autism's program dysfunction, possibly with little relationship with the rest of the spectrum. That's a whole another debate. Some of it might be overexpression, so maladaptive overexpression of certain traits. Some of it is maybe an adaptive strategy. So, it's not like the distinction I was making map 101 on disorders. So, if you give at least disorder how we describe them now. So diagnostic categories are probably interesting inside because there's many potential pathways, and so we don't have one. So I don't expect to have one evolutionary explanation for most mental disorders, to be honest. So I don't think we're going to find this, say, the best explanation for depression. I actually do think that depression is, multiple things, and to some extent, some theories that you can treat them as contrasting theories of depression. They might be actually valid for different subtypes. So, and that's probably the case for things like autism, schizophrenia, and others. And then maybe things when you get to things that are like phobias, simple phobias and stuff like that. Maybe there's one, one good evolutionary explanation, but for like heterogeneous complex disorders, I don't expect that. So, and at the same time, I hope this way of describing disorders makes it clear that the life history approach is not treating disorders by default as strategies, as life history strategies. Um, the connection can be quite indirect. For example, let's say one of the connections could be that some traits that are functionally linked to certain trade-offs, say between mating and parenting and present versus the future, right? Take impulsivity, risk taking. If the argument is right, maybe something like schizotypal traits, especially the positive schizotypal traits, which might be you can see them as a way to in a sense enhance your mating success, maybe at the cost of other potential outcomes. Now, the idea is that yes, there are some traits that connect to this fast slow continuum, but then the pathway to psychopathology might, for example, evolve just by having those traits. You are more vulnerable to certain specific dysfunctions. And so, for example, people high in, say, impulsivity and risk taking, well, those people are more vulnerable to dysregulation of the mechanisms that, for example, mediate, say, behavioral control or decision making. You know, and I hope I'm making this clear. So the connection between i- if you're lucky, you know, this distinction between fast versus slow is helping you organize things in a certain way and gives you like a reference, coordinate. But the disorders themselves, sometimes maybe it's possible that you can think of disorders as adaptive strategies that maybe map on life history strategies more or less directly. So, psychopathy would be, an example. If psychopathy really, at least certain kinds, right, are biologically, adaptive strategies that are, antisocial, exploitative, um, and support, yeah, that a good candidate for Saturn map quite directly, maybe on individual differences, and it's in particular related to mating versus parenting, competition, present benefits, and so on. But something like schizophrenia, there's it's several steps removed, and in many cases you have what the individual differences do is not mapping directly on the disorders, but maybe just making you more vulnerable to certain outcomes, or more vulnerable to certain dysfunctions, or um, so I just wanted to clarify this. I don't know if I haven't been clear. eh, I know what you think. I find it's a hard point to get across because the phrase invites the conflation of disorders with strategies. But I really don't think that's the case. I think that's more of a reference systems, and for some disorder, it doesn't work for all disorders, but I think you can make, useful and interesting distinctions both between disorders and within certain categories by mapping them on these two dimensions of, say, fast versus slow and defense activations versus inactivation. And then, I mean, does it capture all the interesting distinctions? No, I don't think it does. I think there's other uh, ways to parse disorders that are equally good and give you different insights. I'm sure there are. So and and especially most of the disorders we see are going to be stuff that is not adaptive strategies. There's so many pathways, and in many cases, more than one pathway is involved in what we call X, a given disorder. So that was I wanted to make it really clear. Um, the other quick note is about the life history approach is I specifically said that, I see things like impulsivity, risk taking as the core, dimensions of this trait, and this mating parenting trade off as in humans the main thing that needs to be kind of regulated and is the trade off that's driving what have been called, say, fast versus slow traits in the literature. Uh, right now, part of the debate is about the timing of puberty, uh, which is the idea that was also introduced by Jay Besky, the idea that uh, early versus late puberty is kind of a key, very important marker of fast versus slow strategies, connected to not the mating versus parenting trade-off, but the trade-off between current reproduction and future reproduction. So that's, and I've been arguing in the papers and chapter I've written on this topic that uh, first, that the present versus future reproduction is not probably the key trade-off in humans for a number of reasons, but mating versus parenting kind of takes precedence, and also that puberty timing is was a bit, probably a bit of a misdirection in the field, uh, because it, you know, in practice, it doesn't really map well on these other traits. Like, again, I said, no, social sexuality, impulsivity, and they do cluster together and correlate together. Puberty timing is very weakly related to those traits. And I think there are reasons to, reassess the whole thing and think, okay, so maybe puberty timing was not as clean and good and theoretically relevant as a marker of efficacy strategies. And I'm saying this because, again, there's a lot of conflation, and I pointed out before, for example, the assumption that different, individual differences are driven by, say, early stress or early experiences. That that has been part of the approach. It's kind of became baked in early on, and so people kind of criticize the life history approach based on findings that maybe genetics are more important than environmental factors. But I think that these are two separate questions. You should conflate them because, one question is whether this fastest law continuum makes sense. The other question is whether it's more environmentally or genetically determined, and both can be true. Same thing, there's been a lot of, theoretical but especially empirical work just targeted on puberty timing as kind of the how's it called, the lightning rod for the debate, precisely because it's being identified as such a crucial trait. It's easy to study. We actually have big data sets where you can collect data on puberty timing. There's some physiological mechanisms you can study, and so people are really hyper focused on puberty timing. And my opinion is that that probably was a, interesting start, but a bit of a mistake because that's not the right trait to focus on. So with these two, uh, caveats, I think and then, for more details, I have papers, chapters. I don't know if you can link them maybe in the description, but maybe I can give you a few links people can click. So back to your final question. What about the future? Uh, well, I do think so. I think genomics is a big chunk of the future. So, um, if you think from the perspective of, say, evolutionary psychiatry or evolutionary psychopathology, even evolutionary psychology has had a complex and tense relationship with behavior genetics, right? Going back from the the 80s, so maybe even earlier. So there's been a very slow reapproachment between, say, evolutionary thinkers and evolutionary scholars and the tradition of research in genetics and in behavior genetics. So and still few people. So for example, if you go to I don't know, uh, conferences, right, on evolutionary psychology or evolutionary behavioral sciences, you're probably maybe you if you're lucky, you're going to see maybe three or two or three talks that explicitly deal with genetic data. And so most of and the same goes for evolutionary psychiatry. A lot of it is basically centered on a phenotypic level. You're thinking of possible, right, functions, costs and benefits, fitness consequences, and so on and so forth. But there's very little integration with the genetic data. And I do think that it- it's definitely the case that genetic data are revolutionizing psychiatry, right, on their side. But I think the interplay with evolutionary psychiatry will be even more interesting because you know uh, it's not just that you really have to you can use the genetic data to get inputs about the nature of disorders, what are the risk factors, what are the mechanisms involved. So the genetic data can give you really important information about you know things about the disorders, genetic correlations between disorders. There's lots of really interest and informative data from genomics that people can use in evolutionary psychiatry. But at the same time, I think evolutionary psychiatry can actually, if you do it right, can help you, uh, let's say, make sense of the genomic findings in a way that's just impossible if you don't have that kind of toolkit. And one example would be, something like the sexual mating hypothesis for schizophrenia, right? I'm not saying it's necessarily right, but for example, entertaining that kind of hypothesis and being clear about what's the genetic, uh, you know, underpinnings of the hypothesis, which is turns out not to be a simple genetic mechanism. It's like confluence of different factors, each of them may be under a different selection regime, and so on and so forth. Well, actually, that gives you a powerful lens through which you can look at the genetic data and maybe make sense of some strange or uninterpretable patterns in the genomic data themselves. So the data don't interpret themselves even in genomics, and I do think that evolutionary psychiatry has some really interesting tools to uh, enhance and go deeper in interpretation of genetic data. So I think it's going to be an incredibly fruitful interplay, and that's why we organize. I mean, I know that you agree because we organized an entire workshop precisely on that topic, like bridging the evolutionary psychiatry and psychiatric genetics. So
We
that's,
did.
I think, it's what excites me most. And but I also, it's not just genomics. I do think even the humble, say, classic findings for, say, twin studies, the classic behavior genetics. I think it, well, it's been around for longer, but I still think that there are some. Um, we can make progress in really making sense of what, for example, what the genetic data are telling us about the genesis and evolutionary kind of context for different disorders. And I don't think that there's some really interesting places for thinking. For example, uh, how much plasticity is compatible with the genetic data? Just give you, one interesting question, because this is an open, almost entirely open, um, you know, line of research, which is the okay. There's so you look at the genetic data and you see that the shared environment typically explains a small portion of variance, which, by the way, maybe it's understating the contribution of the shared environment, because variance is scaled in a nonlinear way. So you can debate that on a statistical level. But let's say, for some trait, the contribution of the shared environment is actually very small. Now, what is it telling you about the plasticity of the trait? Because the simple interpretation is that the trait is not plastic, or at least is not responding to the factor that are shared within the family, right? Now, um, it turns out, right, that there are some interesting models of plasticity that have roots in evolutionary thinking and stuff, again, by, the evolutionary developmental psychologists like, Jay Besky, Brusellis, and others. Some models of plasticity that when you turn them into actual mathematical models, uh, under certain circumstances, they can actually be compatible with the genetic data. And so, the genetic data falsify very simple and straightforward models of plasticity, but they could be consistent with slightly more sophisticated models. For example, a model in which uh, plasticity is not fixed, is like, but develops partly on environmental inputs. So the early environment, maybe even the prenatal environment, doesn't just make you, higher or lower in a certain trait, but more or less plastic to what comes next. And that's something, that's been discussed and proposed or speculated about. But the really interesting thing is that when you say run the math or the simulations, you actually see that that kind of process could be i- consistent with the genetic data that we see that seem to discount the role of the shared environment quite a bit, even if the shared environment is actually doing things in the development block. Okay, so that intersection between developmental models and genetics, which also it doesn't just apply to, things like personality and so forth, but also to mental disorders and, predispositions to mental disorders. That kind of interface, there's almost zero work being done at the interface. So I do think so. Uh, Genomics, yes, but even with the, basic behavior genetics data, I think, if we sharpen the models and actually make them more explicit and more formal, we're going to find that there's more play, more room for interesting interactions between the environment and the genes, than currently. We tend to be a bit black and white or very crude in the kind of models we entertain. Um,
Interesting.
one more, since you gave me, this little pulpit, but I'm going to say one really interesting direction for evolutionary psychiatry, I think, would be to engage more with the computational psychiatry. So, genomics is one really big thing, and obviously we talk about it, but I think there's been, lots of exciting progress in the computational approaches to mental disorder, where you're trying to, again, formalize, simulate, and try to elucidate the specific cognitive mechanisms that underlie the symptoms or the risk, and you do this again with computational modeling of various kinds. And the interesting thing there is, again. Um, why is that interesting, right, and important for say evolutionary psychiatry to go there? Well, first thing, it really uh helps you, or forces you even to focus on the proximate level, not just the ultimate, to get a bit more specific, not just about, broad select, fitness, and selection pressures, and but get a bit more specific about the mechanistic implementation. And that can help you again, usually when you're dealing with mechanisms and adaptive explanations together, you can make progress, because you see maybe some adaptive explanations are, not consistent with the mechanisms, or so. Again, it gives you information in one direction. At the same time, I think, well, there are exceptions, but a lot of the work in computational psychiatry, I think, is very naive about the functions of cognition and behavior. So, for example, a lot of work is, basically default into the assumptions that what you're trying to do as an organ is maximizing rewards, right? All these computational models that rely on some kind of, say, reinforcement learning or so. The idea is you're looking at the maximization of rewards. And well, that's, sometimes that works. But in many other cases, the ultimate goal, the currency for success, the organ is not rewards, but is inclusive fitness. And sometimes there might be a big gap between maximizing rewards in the present and your, overall kind of fitness long term. So that's one example, or um, one big insight that comes from biology and, evolutionary biology, is that many behaviors, but also the cognitive, right, processes that underlie the behaviors, uh, don't just, they don't just function to help you deal with the environment, but they're also signaling things. So there's
This is
signals.
something, there's something interesting here to connect both what you've said about genomics and also computational psychiatry, which is just that the evolutionary perspective gives you a better framework to understand what you're doing. When you find the different alleles associated with autism, what do they mean? Well, you kind of need the evolutionary framing to understand that there's differences between de novo mutations or recent rare mutations and common alleles which have been floating around for hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years. And they're not all just disease genes and can be categorized together. You need something like your analysis, which looks at where there could be functional purposes to them, and maybe at a population level, and then to just make sense of that. And then same with computational psychiatry. You just need a good idea of what the mind is doing. What are the rewards we're meant to be seeking, and the context.
What is the organ is actually doing, and that's some things are very domain specific. So just looking at general rewards maybe it's not telling you you're not asking the right question, and many times you're kind of implicitly using some kind of whatever money as a this pretty common in say economic games, right? But lots of computational experiments where you're maximizing kind of what scores, points, money, whatever. But people deal with different kinds of rewards sometimes differently. Food, you respond to food in a different way you respond to sex, for example. It's not, they still have both rewards, but they work in different ways. So, in the signaling function, I think it's pretty important because that's usually there's a paradigm constraint there. It's usually in the computational task there's you in front of the computer playing some kind of games or task and being more or less successful or trying to do different things. And so it's not a kind of setting that invites you to think about the signaling functions of cognition and behavior. And that's potentially for things again, if something like vaguely like the sexual selection mating theory of say psychosis and schizotypy is correct, some of these traits are not they're not doing anything for you in terms of say problem solving. What they're doing is is working as that kind of signal, maybe an attractive signal or something like that, and that's very alien like mainstream computational. So uh, I think, and that's something I tried to lay out briefly. If you read the book, the 2018 book, the last chapter has my thoughts about the future and what would be really cool, new things to do, and that hasn't changed a lot because it was suggesting, genomics, genetics and genomics. Um, then the computational psychiatry would be a really beneficial field to kind of merge and engage more with. And then I also think that there's a unique contribution that evolutionary psychiatry could give to epidemiology because once again, if you look at psychiatry epidemiology, that it's another field in which if you're just empirically driven, you're kind of lost in the data because you're finding these big patterns that something like the ACEs, right? The adverse, what was the, damn it.
Yeah, it's just lots of different stresses, right? You count the amount of stresses in someone's life, basically, and you add them up. Adverse childhood experiences.
Childhood. That's childhood, yes. So that's, that's a lots of work being done on that. Again, because it's relatively easy to measure, but again, um, it's so broad and generic, right? And you're mixing up. So, for example, if you look into what constitutes, right, an adverse childhood experiences, some of them are maybe, um, kind of acts of, let's say, bad luck in your environment. But sometimes it's stuff that can actually be influenced by people's say behavior and decisions. So maybe there's stuff that is actually capturing some kind of genetic confounds and so on and so forth. So some of those things may actually be part of strategies. So if you look think of say family instability and divorce, right? You can look at it as a stressor for children growing up. Sure. At the same time, it's possible that what you're seeing is not just stress and adversity, but it's people who have a certain, so for example, who are, let's say, on the fast end of this fast low continuum. They are more sexually unrestricted, more impulsive, and so on and so forth, and so they will tend to be, to divorce more often, to have more unstable couple relationships. They're kind of mixing up, right? Different aspects of the environment, behavior, strategies, outcomes, and that's, I think, a severe limitation on this kind of, we say, environmental epidemiology of mental disorders. Um, and so, see, an evolutionary approach would help you. See, you can, so and you, as usual, like the kind of default response is try to whatever, get more data and use machine learning, right? It's picture tells me, but it's just get bigger data and it's a bigger algorithm and try to sort it out. But again, I'm skeptical that it takes you very far, because sometimes you really need some theoretical guidance to know what the good distinctions are and how not to mix up different things that should be, separate. And so I do think that evolutionary psychiatry has a lot to offer to epidemiology, uh, and has done some that there's already been some work on it, more than the developmental process. I think, developmental processes and plasticity versus genetics is kind of almost virgin territory. Genomic, I think it's starting now to really, the conversation between the evolutionary side and the folks working on genomics is just getting started in a way, and it's going to be very exciting. And computational psychiatry, again, I think there's very little connection, and there could be much more work. Epidemiology, that's the area where there's already been more work than in these other areas. But I do think there's so many low hanging fruits. Like, for example, how to parse environmental stressors, um, how to identify maybe things that could be protective for certain disorders but harmful for other disorders. Right, and that's what trade off thinking is you. So yeah, uh,
Yeah. So
that's
yeah,
my
I wonder. I agree. These are great responses. I think when you look across psychology in comparison to evolutionary psychology, I think there's like something interesting has gone on there where most psychologists are not evolutionary psychologists as defined. However, more and more psychologists sort of have a little bit of evolutionary thinking. They all kind of know about it. They all sort of think it's sort of there, and they might take it into account and they might mention it as an aside, but actually they're doing developmental psychology, and they're running their experiments on kids in playgroups or whatever, but actually they sort of know. And John Heitzberg is an interesting one recently, where he's not actually an evolutionary psychologist in like a traditional sense, but he does reference evolutionary psychology a lot. And I think so. I think that it's sort of seeping into the culture in a way which is not like everyone just becomes an evolutionary psychiatrist, but you just hear about it more. You use it as a guiding kind of framing for your understanding of what you're doing in your experiments, how you should design your experiments, whether you should be comparing the schizophrenics to controls or whether you should be looking at their relatives as well. That sort of thing is big, and as you say, it just has so many downstream effects on how you run the experiments that could lead to a scientific revolution where we suddenly understand everything.
we'll see. I mean, psychotherapy is another, again, I don't expect, mm, you know, that's at least my take, right? Psychotherapy, more or less, I mean, you have a menu of things you can do, like, um, from, say, I don't know, uh, thinking in different ways about events, or I don't know, imagining, using imagination in certain ways, or
Exposure.
using, I don't know, uh, you can breathe the breathing techniques, or meditation. But it's just stuff that's being, you can combine them in interesting ways, right? Like, you give right, EMBR, yeah. Let's not go there, but with that, that's yet there actually is a great. I think that's a great illustration of what I'm about to say, which is that the stuff that actually works or does things in therapy is usually stuff that's being around for a long time. And for EMDR, again, it looks like, again, I haven't checked, recently, but what I remember is that you can do this kind of these method studies, try to do it, for example, without the eye movements and stuff. And it looks like, yes, it works, but what actually works is mostly like the exposure and the relaxation and the kind of, so and the eye movement components kind of, adds a bit of flair, flair and edge. Yeah. And maybe, it's a, which is not, I mean, I don't discount that completely, because sometimes, why not? Uh,
Do the
but
ritual. Yeah.
yes,
Taking it
that's
on.
the active ingredient, right? Um, so, and what actually people do in therapy, if you look at very different, schools of psychotherapy and approaches, is actually remixing a limited number of things you can do when you're, say, talking to a person or interacting with a person or in a group. And so I don't. So what I'm saying is that I don't expect, say, evolutionary thinking about psychopathologies to give you uh, incredible new forms of therapy, especially in psychotherapy, right? Um, I don't expect, like, maybe you can tweak things in a different way. Maybe, helps you being. I do think, understanding having a good, let's say, good ideas about for example, the genesis of certain disorders of different maybe subtypes or whatnot, helps you maybe focus the intervention right. For example, if it's if you're thinking of a disorder as, say, a hyperactive defense, you maybe go about it in a slightly different way. If you think it's, say, some kind of adaptive strategy, maybe some adaptive learning mechanism that's stuck in a kind of self-reinforcing loop. So yeah, it definitely helps you orient your clinical work, but I don't expect entirely new forms of therapy to come out of it. However, um, it's extremely powerful uh, as a narrative. It gives you really good narratives and ways of thinking, from even something as basic as thinking in terms of trade-offs, thinking explicitly in terms of trade-offs, which is, again, not uniquely evolutionary, but evolutionary psychology, I think, gives you pretty good ways thinking about trade-offs and or conflicts. For example, the what an evolutionary perspective does, among other things, is gives you very really grounded understanding of why social relationships involve an element of conflict. That's not necessarily a pathology or like a social disturbance or an imperfection in how we do things. But for example, let's say, parents and children, uh, parent offspring conflict theory, it gives you reasons to expect that in some ways, on certain issues and certain, uh, what you see when you look at parents and children is as some element of negotiating terms where the two parties are actually in conflict about things, right?
So that's answering why is it so hard? Why can't we? I know, yeah, yeah. Like there's so much conflict. What the hell's going on? Is this normal? Why do I obsess over this person so much? Why am I so worried? Whatever. Yeah, right. Actually, giving a narrative.
Some, I think, then, I mean, it depends on your, I guess, personal maturity and approaches. But I think in many cases kind of the background, right, for thinking about conflicts. It's easy to, in psychology, to have this kind of naive, or I don't know how to call it, but the idea that conflict, all conflicts could be avoided if we do things right.
It's just bad. This is
To
just
say, no, actually, some conflicts are, not just here to stay, but they're actually, there's a very strong and powerful reason that's baked in our genetics why we have, different fitness interests. And of course, conflicts are going to get resolved and negotiated. So it's not like, uh, it's not, I don't think it's a pessimistic outlook, but, it's something that you have to integrate in the way you're thinking about, say, I don't know, couple relationships, or things like, sexuality and jealousy and, parent-child relationships and so on and so forth. I think, the conflict element uh, is something that comes out, and I think it gives you a level of, say, um, acceptance, right?
and direction sometimes. Yeah, like how do you resolve this? You actually have to give something. The kid is never going to just give in to all your demands. They're their own individual. You need to let them go. They need to become an adult. Um,
And then, that's just an example, but I think there are things, so there's some concepts and ideas that come out very powerfully from evolutionary outlook that are actually very useful in psychotherapy and in, actual work with patients. Also, in terms of, narratives that is not just for the therapist but for the patient as well. When you do, the element of, say, psychoeducation that goes on in therapy.
yeah.
And that's why I think people actually, if you open, any CBT, or self-help, little manual on anxiety and phobias and so forth, more likely than not, at this point, you find some kind of little evolutionary just so story of the kind, oh, there were tigers and dangerous animals, so that's why.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
right. Which is, I don't think it's sometimes, many times they're not very accurate, uh, but they were, still, even in this kind of crude
Does it
form,
matter?
and they are useful, right?
Mm.
So, and that's why I think you know, here's where I think, let's say, evolutionary, clinical psychology should kind of embrace the opportunities and the challenges. And one thing you realize is some kinds of explanation stick very, very easily, like mismatch explanations. They stick. Um, adaptive explanations where the disorder is not really a disorder, is actually good, those stick. But then there are
Spectrums of inclusive fitness die stick. Yeah.
the things that are a bit more complicated, where maybe it's, yeah, there's an adaptive level, but the other level it's not adaptive, and maybe it's has more to do with kind of um it's not just a dysfunction either. It's not just broken, but kind of and that those explanations, again, are really important. uh they're not as, say, intuitive, and they don't stick as easily, to the
Mm.
clinician's mind. But this is where I think there's some interesting work to be done to make that kind of explanation uh kind of accessible in a usable form, you see, in clinical work. And then, of course, I mean, the other risk, of course, is that people using these kinds of narratives and explanation in psychotherapy will, well, prematurely embrace the explanations that turn out to be wrong. So that's for the but that's you know that's maybe
I
a
mean, the explanations in all of clinical psychology have been wrong ever, so it just won't be any.
it's not uniquely bad and not worse than other thing. But uh how do I frame this? Let me put it this way. So there's work to be done. Interesting, and it's actually also fun work. So, for example, let's give you some personal anecdotes. So, for example, in Italy is a bit of a strange country, as you probably know. But one of the unique things about Italy that few people know is that so CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, in Italy, unlike most other places, most other countries, there's actually a pretty strong evolutionary influence because of, there's been a, if you actually, probably the most important person has been Giovanni Liotti. He was a clinician, but also very interested in attachment theory, but also evolutionary issues more broadly. And he did a lot to, he was developing ideas very close to, Paul Gilbert's ideas of motivation, and so about, motivational systems, attachment, and so forth. So he had, uh, but he was very good at, let's say, sending this to clinician in a way that really work. And it turns out that some of these ideas are actually very helpful to deal with, certain kind of patients, certain kind of, aspects of the setting. So and by, I think, historical accident, really what you have in Italy is that a whole lot of, not everybody, but a very so substantial fraction of CBT practitioners have at least some vague ideas about evolution and motivational systems, and like, no,
Cool.
that's great. Uh, and at the same time, because most clinicians and therapists are not, reading the primarily, they're not. It's not like they're reading the biological literature or even the psych stuff necessarily. So there's been this one, let's say, translation event in which some evolutionary concepts have been kind of introduced into Italian CBT, but after that, it's kind of become largely insulated. So then it's become kind of self perpetuating, and so some ideas, I think, they're a bit out of date, and there's been some really interesting work on motivation from an evolutionary perspective that can be used to, revise some ideas and extend them, and so
Your work, Marco, perhaps. Isn't this your work?
it is my work. That's it. Nope, done. did what I do. I've done some workshops and some kind of uh, interactions with the clinicians, and what I find is that they're very open to they're very responsive to this. And even so, what I'm saying is that even in an environment like Italy, where you actually had this historically kind of anomalous uptake of some evolutionary concepts, then what happens in the translation between, say, biology, evolutionary psychology to clinical psychology, um,
Hmm.
then it's something you have to keep doing over time, because the clinicians are probably going to hear, maybe learn some interesting concepts and get some interesting ideas, but they're probably not going to engage very much with the primary literature. And so I think there's a work of translations for clinicians and kind of updating what new things. Even but attachment theory is a good example, like slightly less clinical, but attachment theory is a probably a great prototype of that. John Bowlby basically devised attachment theory uh, using the evolutionary biology of the time, ethological concepts, and so it's strongly grounded in evolutionary theory. But that's the evolutionary theory of the late 50s, early 60s. And then it's taken kind of a life of its own. And right now, most people who work in attachment theory, they either don't think about evolution much, or they're kind of defaulting to Bowlby's kind of evolutionary biology of the early 60s. And it turns out that for certain issues, for example, sex differences in attachment that don't really, you can frame them in the classic, literature, or there's been, stuff in biology about, say, sexual selection, mating, pair not spring conflict, and other things, like that, that actually can be used to update attachment theory in very interesting ways, but that just doesn't happen automatically. You really need, and this is also my work in a sense, because I, I try to make contributions in this direction, but I, at several times, what I've basically tried to do is to, suggest ways to amend or update certain ideas in attachment theory, essentially based on uh, the biology and evolutionary psychology of the 2010s or like 2020s, instead of Bobby's, original version that's kind of, become the default assumption. So there's lots, and that's true for clinical psychology too. So I think, we talk about research, and we have some really interesting, and largely unexplored directions where people could, interact with, again, genomics, computational psychiatry, and so on and so forth. But even thinking about clinical work in psychotherapy, I think there's many interesting opportunities, and um,
It's a good time to mention that in the UK, this is the first podcast I'm recording since this has been established. We've just managed to establish a charitable foundation with the explicit goal of educating and also funding research, but educating especially clinicians and scientists on evolutionary psychiatry. Because, yeah, I agree, there is this gap, and I think there are so many people who will hear a little bit and think, "Oh, that sounds really interesting. Where do you start, and what materials do you go to?" And it's a hard, your book is an excellent place, but it is quite dense and like scientific, and that's more like almost primary literature, right? We need just simple things to tell the clinicians, and maybe, yeah, new ways to summarize, for instance, this kind of weird trade-off.
that's
And
polarized, translated to say, and that's it really takes a special kind of skill to translate these kind of concepts in a way that clinicians can, use effectively and understand effectively. And there's another set of skills to then do the kind of updating work, which is uh, which is also the interesting issue. So yeah,
yeah,
I think
well, it
lots of there's
like good issue.
the book. Uh, the Let me see if maybe it's here. Nope. The title is The New CBT.
Oh yeah, Mike
Okay.
Abrams. Yeah.
For Abram. Yes. And that's
So,
here's, that's another good example, because it's a book where, it's explicitly, the goal is explicitly to kind of, update the thinking, and maybe some intervention in CBT based on evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology. And that's, I think it's a great example, because the book has some excellent, I think it has some excellent parts, some also good advice. So, from clinical standpoint, it's kind of, I think it's a good, and that's pitched exactly at the right level, I think, so if you want to see a good example of what could be the right, the right middle between the research based stuff and what clinicians can use, I think that would be a good.
I think I've got my copy over there somewhere. Yeah, it's
Oh, perfect. Yeah, it's not. But at the same time, for example, one thing about that book is that it really relies a lot on mismatch. So that's one weakness in the book is that really over relies on mismatch explanations.
and
And it doesn't.
interpretation of heritability estimates as being meaning a trait is completely fixed is also like not flawed. Not justified.
I have my comments and my criticisms of the book. Um, I just think it's a good illustration both of. I think it's a good it's a good inspiration if you want to write a book that's kind of hitting the right level where you're communicating at a level that clinicians can use and understand kind of effectively. It also illustrates some of the pitfalls. So, for example, the web. As was mentioned, like the mismatch explanations are very intuitive, very fun, kind of the, just the right amount of counterintuitive. That's kind of and so they stick very easily. And so one of the dangers is that you just uncritically kind of over rely on them, or then again interpret the genetic data in a simplistic way. For example, as you were mentioning, like equating high irritability with uh
Big fix. Big fix are not changeable. Like, oh, psychopathy is inheritable, so you can't try and change psychopathic behavior.
we use drugs or that kind of again that kind of simplistic thinking. I think it's not just a problem in clinical psychology. I think it's in subtler ways it also exists currently in the literature that kind of negotiates between evolutionary psychology and behavior genetics. And I think there's again interesting work to do at many different levels, from the translations for clinicians to cutting edge genomics research. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Marco, for my longest podcast episode to date.
I did. I knew it.
I wondered if it would be, but also I would say one of the most fruitful. I think I've learned more about your life history, your exact perspective on life history, than I knew before. Even though we've spent a lot of time talking and going back and forth and stuff, I did actually learn something new here. This wasn't just me repeating it for the audience, so that was good. I thought that was a really
Well, I actually I know I'm aware that it was a bit long-winded and a bit fastidious at points, but I actually know I've been kind of doing this for a while, and so I know that there are some conflations and some misinterpretation of this perspective, and so I was going to try to dispel them. So thankful.
you did sort of mostly, yes. Or like at least you did. It was definitely changed. So well, yeah, see great ideas. Thank you so much for coming on. It was great.
Thank you.
The Evolving Psychiatry podcast is financially supported by the Human Ecology Group of the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine at the University of Zurich.